Welcome to Present Perfect. No grammar, but plenty of history. I'm Don Congdon, your host and guide, helping you explore how the past reaches out and touches the present. This is podcast number 116. When it comes to examining the Renaissance, where do you begin? Great art? The city of Florence? The Medici family? Galileo? The printing press? The Age of Exploration? Shakespeare? Any one of these topics would be both interesting and relevant, but the subject is almost too rich. For this reason, I'm not going to try to handle it in a podcast or two. Instead, I'm going to make just 3 points and then move back to the topic of biblical manuscripts. But the Renaissance will always be in the background. It just can't help it. Point number 1. All historians have their favorite dates for the beginning and end of the Renaissance. To keep matters simple, I'm going to pick 2 reasonable ones, 1400 and 1650. My dates are no better or more brilliant than anyone else's, but they're easy to remember and they bracket the major events of Renaissance history. And if you've been paying attention, you've probably noticed that my dates overlap those of the late Middle Ages. That's intentional. Point number 2. No matter what you've been taught, the Renaissance wasn't like a giant light bulb that suddenly came on in the darkness of medieval Europe. Those light-dark metaphors are a product of the Victorian era, not sound historiography. Late medieval Europe transitioned into Renaissance Europe. The world definitely changed, but it wasn't something that happened overnight. And remember, nobody woke up one morning rejoicing that the Renaissance had dawned at last. It's something that became apparent over a period of time. Rather than light versus dark, I think it makes more sense to characterize the Renaissance as a time in which changes happened at an accelerated pace. If you want a more recent example of this phenomenon, think of the technological changes that happened between 1945 and today. It's the same basic idea. Point number 3. The Renaissance involved a complex series of events happening in many disparate areas. Collectively, these led to a changed and perhaps somewhat better world. From the perspective of the church historian, I'd say that 2 areas are particularly relevant. First of all, the Western world once again learned Greek and Hebrew. And secondly, new technologies like movable type printing made it much easier to disseminate new ideas. Yes, that's pretty terse, but it works for what we're doing today. You'll definitely hear more from me on this subject in a future podcast series, and then we'll give it the justice it deserves. As you've probably guessed, we're leaving the medieval world of John Wycliffe and moving into this time of rapid and significant change. We'll begin in 1397 with the arrival of a man named Emmanuel Chrysoloras in the city of Florence. You may be wondering what was so special about this man. And you'll probably have to stifle a yawn when I tell you that he taught Greek language and literature. As I mentioned when we looked at the life of John Wycliffe, Greek and Hebrew scholarship had died out in Western Europe during the Middle Ages. Classical Greek literature had largely become inaccessible. On the other hand, Greek scholarship had remained active in the Eastern Roman Empire and in the Islamic world. Latin translations of Greek scientific and philosophical works had come into Western Europe through Muslim contacts, as had Islamic mathematics and medicine. But the Greek language and many literary works remained unknown for hundreds of years. Born in Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, Chrysoloras taught Greek in the city of Florence, the heart of Renaissance Italy. Over the next 15 years or so, he moved around Italy, teaching in several of its major cities. He also produced a textbook to help students master Greek grammar. Although he was just one man, Chrysoloras catalyzed a movement that would have wide implications in Europe. It came to be called Renaissance humanism. Many believers react negatively to the term humanism, and certainly what goes by that name today is very negative. But we must remember that Renaissance humanism was an entirely different animal. Although it's a complex topic, we can sum up its key qualities fairly easily. If you're familiar with the liberal arts courses that are a part of many college curricula, then you're looking at a descendant of Renaissance humanism. This movement emphasized human development and expression through art, literature, language, culture, and technology. It also explored human beings themselves, looking at how their bodies worked, how their languages developed, and how they thought and felt. Renaissance humanists appreciated men like Chrysoloras since they made it possible for them to explore the dim worlds of classical Greek and Rome. Using their new linguistic skills, they delved into forgotten literature and began to recover ideas that had been shunted to the side for centuries. One event proved particularly helpful despite its overall tragedy. After lasting nearly 1,000 years longer than the Western Roman Empire, the eastern part finally fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. This shift in political power had a number of implications that were to play out over the next century or so. But for Renaissance humanism, it had a beneficial side effect. When Constantinople fell and the Turks moved in, many scholars packed up their libraries and headed west. Countless valuable manuscripts and the knowledge to translate them migrated into Europe. The East's loss was the West's gain, and rapid intellectual expansion followed, particularly in the field of ancient linguistics. At almost the same time, an important new technology appeared in Mainz, Germany: metal, movable type printing developed by Johannes Gutenberg. Probably no other Renaissance invention was so significant or had such widespread implications. Within just a few decades, affordable books flooded Europe, disseminating new ideas and encouraging general literacy. Just as the Internet led to worldwide connectedness in the early 21st century, so too did printing create a comparable stir in the early 16th. Set within this new world of linguistic awareness and rapid knowledge propagation, we enter another phase of biblical textual scholarship. Some of the methodologies that would reach their mature form in the 19th century started here. We're going to meet a very important new manuscript collection as well as the rather clever man who produced it. But first, I need to introduce some of the key ideas behind the scholarly discipline known as textual criticism. By the way, don't be put off by the word criticism. It's a good thing, and it has nothing to do with the higher criticism movement of the 19th century, which was anything but good. Textual criticism is the scholarly practice of using existing documents to work out what a lost original text was like. Obviously, we're going to look at biblical textual criticism, but the techniques that textual critics follow can work with any kind of literary text. So how does this process work? It begins with whatever existing manuscripts the textual critic has access to. These are called witnesses. If the critic considers one manuscript as superior to or more complete than the others, it's sometimes called the base text. Using the available witnesses, the textual critic tries to reconstruct what the original text was like. In the case of a biblical manuscript, the original is the autograph. This means working back through centuries of changes, errors, omissions, additions, and other problems. Think of it as an error correction process leading back to the source text. When the work is finished, the base text has been edited and modified in such a way that the critic believes it to be a good representation of the original. It's then called a critical text. From there, it can be used for study or to produce translations. This is just one form of textual criticism, but I think it gives you an idea of how the process works. When we get to the 19th century, we're going to discuss the subject in much greater depth, but for now, that's enough to understand the methods used in the 16th century. As you've already learned in earlier podcasts, the world of late antiquity contained many copies of the New Testament. Some of these survived, while others were copied and copied and copied. Today, scholars have access to about 5,700 Greek New Testament manuscripts. Obviously, these existed in the 16th century, although many of them were not accessible to the textual scholars of the time. Today, they're well organized and classified according to the part of the world in which they were produced. In many cases, this information has been deduced from the text itself by examining the form and style of the characters. This identification system is called text type. New Testament manuscripts fall into three major text type categories: Byzantine text-type manuscripts are named for the city of Byzantium, which was renamed Constantinople in the 4th century. Manuscripts of this type were produced in the world of the Eastern Roman Empire, which later came to be called the Byzantine Empire. When the Turks captured Constantinople in 1453, they unknowingly sent many Byzantine text-type manuscripts westward for eager Europeans to examine. Most surviving manuscripts are of this variety, so they're sometimes called the majority text. Be aware, however, that this term also has a more specialized application. To prevent confusion, I'm going to use the term Byzantine text type and reserve majority text for its specialized use, which we'll discuss in a later podcast. Most of the Byzantine text type manuscripts are a fairly recent date and are therefore not particularly close in time to the autographs. While a few date back to the 5th century, most are from the 10th through 14th centuries. Because they're so numerous, however, they provide a lot of data for the textual critic. Western text-type manuscripts usually were produced within the Western Roman Empire, although some come from Syria. There are fewer of these than those of the Byzantine text type, but they're often older. Due to their style, which leans toward paraphrasing, some scholars don't consider them as reliable as the other text types. The Alexandrian text-type manuscripts come from the area around the Egyptian city of Alexandria. This city was a major center of scholarship and book production. You may recall the famous Library of Alexandria. Alexandrian manuscripts tend to be the oldest, although there aren't nearly as many of them. Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Vaticanus, and Codex Alexandrinus, which you learned about in podcast number 109, are mostly of this text type. Alexandrian text type manuscripts are often rougher in style than Byzantine. Many textual scholars take this difference to mean that they're closer to the original text. The smoothness of the Byzantine manuscripts suggests that the scribes who copied them may have done a little tweaking to improve the readability and style. In the 16th century, most of the manuscripts available to textual scholars were of the Byzantine text type. For this reason, the critical editions that they produced are based around them. Not until the 19th century did the other two text types exert a significant influence on biblical scholarship. We now come to the textual efforts of a man whom many consider the quintessential Renaissance humanist and scholar, Desiderius Erasmus. Erasmus was a Dutch priest, theologian, scholar, philosopher, and textual expert. Born in the 15th century and living well into the 16th, he was ideally placed in time to exemplify the qualities that we've come to associate with a Renaissance man. While he remained a devout Roman Catholic his whole life, he was deeply critical of the moral failures that he saw in the Church. Unlike men such as Martin Luther, however, Erasmus felt that the Church's doctrinal positions were largely sound and had survived the test of time. He wanted moral reforms within the Church, not doctrinal. Erasmus had a peculiar relationship with many of the reformers. On the one hand, he recognized the validity of some of their claims and had a certain degree of respect for them. But he feared the violence that sometimes accompanied their volcanic social changes. On the whole, Erasmus tried to remain as neutral as possible and preserve his own loyalties to the Church. Similarly, many of the reformers had mixed feelings about Erasmus. While they loved his scholarship and appreciated his textual skills, they were frustrated by his unwillingness to break with Rome. At the same time, if a single man should receive the credit or blame for the Reformation, that man probably is Erasmus. Whether he intended it or not, his love of textual criticism provided the spark that ignited the Reformation of the 16th century. It all began with his unhappiness over the quality of Jerome's Latin Vulgate. As he read Paul's letter to the Romans in that translation, he suspected that the original audience would have been appalled at the quality of the Latin. He decided to fix matters by producing a new Latin translation. Since the Latin Vulgate had such stature, however, he knew that some would criticize his changes and improvements. To lend credibility to his work, he decided to assemble a critical text from the available Greek manuscripts and place it side by side with his new Latin translation. Naysayers would see from the Greek that he had done a better job than Jerome. Ironically, what he produced became famous not for his Latin translation, but for the Greek text included with it. And that is what we're concerned with as well. For it was this Greek critical text that the Reformers read when they focused their attention on Scripture alone. And when they decided to produce new Bible translations in the languages of common use, it was Erasmus's critical text that they used. You may possibly have heard of it under one or more of its present-day names: Receive Text, Textus Receptus, or, if you prefer the reconstructed Latin pronunciation, Textus Receptus. But many just call it the TR, which is much easier to say. But alas, I can't say any more about it now. Our time is up. Next time, we'll go deeper into the history of the TR and see how it exerted a major influence on many different people throughout the 16th century. Be sure to come back because it's a fascinating tale. So until next time, I'm Don Congdon, and this is Present Perfect. Have a great day. Present Perfect is a copyright of Don Congdon. Music is copyright Footage Firm Incorporated. Scripture quotations are from the New American Standard Bible, which is a copyright of the Lockman Foundation.